He thought the storm was the only danger that night, the kind that soaked the streets and chased people indoors. But as he helped the frail old man through the roaring wind, he felt something else. Something watching, something waiting. By morning, that feeling turned real. 3 men in dark suits swept into his neighborhood, showing his picture, knocking on doors, asking questions no one dared answer. Their voices were calm, but their intentions felt cold. Why would powerful men hunt for a poor black boy whose only mistake was doing the right thing? If stories like this move you, make sure you subscribe. Because what happens next is something no one should face alone, and every voice matters when the truth is this hard to ignore. But then he saw something that made him stop. An elderly man, thin, frail, and fighting against the wind, was stumbling along the sidewalk ahead. His coat whipped violently around him, and his cane barely touched the ground in time to catch his balance. The man moved like someone who should have been indoors hours ago, someone who had no business being out in a storm like this. The boy hesitated, rain dripping from his hair, watching the old man sway dangerously. He could have kept walking. Most people would have. No one would have blamed him for choosing safety over a stranger. But something inside him refused to look away. Even with the storm roaring, even with the cold seeping into his bones, a quiet instinct tugged at him, an instinct that told him he couldn't just leave the man there. He jogged forward, calling out through the wind, though his voice was swallowed by the storm. When he reached the man, he gently touched his arm, offering support. The old man's eyes, dimmed by age and rain, widened in surprise, then softened with gratitude. Without words, the boy guided him, taking slow steps toward what the man indicated as his home. A small house tucked behind untamed bushes and a sagging fence. Every step felt like a battle against the storm, each gust of wind threatening to knock them over. The rain hammered their backs, stinging their skin and making the path slippery beneath their feet. The boy kept his arm steady beneath the old man's, sensing how close he was to collapsing. At moments the man seemed barely conscious, his body shuddering with exhaustion, his grip on the cane loosened by the cold. But the boy didn't let go. He kept talking softly even though the storm drowned out every word, hoping the old man could feel the reassurance in his presence. Lightning cracked open the sky above them, illuminating the street in blinding white for a split second, casting long, trembling shadows of their figures across the pavement. For that brief moment, it looked like the world had frozen around them. 2 lives crossing paths in a storm neither had been prepared for. They pushed forward until the small house finally came into view, its porch light flickering weakly through the sheets of rain. Relief washed through the boy's chest. He helped the old man climb the steps, steadying him as the wind shoved them sideways. When the door opened, the old man gave a shaky nod of thanks before disappearing inside. The boy lingered only long enough to make sure the door closed securely. Then, soaked to the bone, he turned back into the storm, unaware that unseen eyes had followed them through the darkness. He jogged forward, calling out through the wind, though his voice was swallowed by the storm. When he reached the man, he gently touched his arm, offering support. The old man's eyes, dimmed by age and rain, widened in surprise, then softened with gratitude. Without words, the boy guided him, taking slow steps toward what the man indicated as his home, a small house tucked behind untamed bushes and a sagging fence. The journey took longer than expected, each gust of wind threatening to knock them over, each flash of lightning reminding them how dangerous the night had become. The boy felt the man's frailty in the way he leaned heavily against him, each step shaky, each breath shallow and strained. Rain soaked through both their clothes, clinging to their skin, chilling them to the bone, but the boy kept moving, tightening his grip whenever the old man stumbled. The storm refused to let up, roaring against rooftops and rattling loose shutters as the 2 figures battled their way down the narrow path. The boy tried to shield the old man with his body, turning his shoulder into the wind, but the force of it pushed them both sideways, nearly sending them into a muddy patch along the fence line. Still, he didn't stop. Something inside him, something steady, something stubborn, pushed him forward. When they finally reached the porch steps, the old man's legs buckled, and the boy caught him just in time, lowering him gently onto the railing. He knocked on the door, then helped the old man inside when it creaked open. Warm light spilled out onto the porch, contrasting sharply with the cold storm behind them. The old man gave a shaky nod of thanks before disappearing into the dim interior. The boy stood in the doorway a moment longer, making sure he was fully inside. Then he stepped back into the rain, watching the door close with a soft thud. For a brief second, he felt a sense of quiet accomplishment, something small but meaningful, a reminder that kindness still mattered even when no one was watching. But he couldn't have known, that someone was watching. Hidden faces peered through cracked curtains. Shadows shifted behind darkened windows. People whispered in the shelter of their homes, murmuring about storms, strangers, and the boy who had unknowingly stepped into something far larger than the storm itself. He pulled his hood over his head and walked back into the night, unaware that every step he took away from the old man's door was leading him toward a danger he could never have imagined. They reached the house at last, both soaked to the bone. The boy watched as the old man disappeared inside with a shaky nod of thanks. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't wait for praise. He simply made sure the door was closed, then turned back to begin his own walk home. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that eyes hidden behind curtains had followed every step. Shadows moved inside homes where people whispered about strangers, storms, and the child who had unknowingly walked into something far bigger than he could imagine. He continued down the street, feeling the storm press harder against him. The wind howled louder, rattling signs and slamming shutters. He picked up his pace, wanting only to reach the warmth of home. But as he turned onto a narrower road, a new sound threaded through the storm, the low, steady rumble of an engine. Not a car speeding through the weather. No, this one was moving slowly, deliberately. He didn't turn around at first. He kept walking, listening as the engine crawled behind him, matching his pace. His heartbeat quickened, each thud echoing in his ears. The storm seemed to fade behind the sound of that slow-moving car. Every hair on his arm stood on end, and a familiar, unwelcome sensation crept over him, the feeling of eyes on his back. When he finally looked over his shoulder, he saw a sleek, unfamiliar car with tinted windows creeping forward. Its headlights flickered slightly in the rain, casting long reflections that shimmered like silent threats across the pavement. The boy's breath hitched. He looked away quickly and kept walking, telling himself it was nothing, telling himself he was imagining things. But deep down, he knew better. Sometimes danger didn't shout, sometimes it whispered. He clutched the straps of his backpack tighter, pulling them closer to his chest as he rounded the next corner. The car slowed even more, its movement almost unnatural, as if whoever was inside didn't want to overtly follow him, just to remind him that he was being watched. The rain blurred the world around him into streaks of shadow and light, but the dark shape of the car remained clear. He turned onto another street, then another, quickening his pace until he was nearly running. Finally, the rumble of the engine faded into the storm behind him. By the time he reached his apartment building, the car was gone, swallowed by the dark rain. He hurried inside, dripping water onto the worn floorboards, his clothes clinging heavily to his skin. His mother glanced at him but didn't ask why he looked shaken. He wouldn't have known how to explain it anyway. He changed into warm clothes, tried to calm his breathing, and finally lay in bed long after the storm died down, staring at the ceiling. But sleep didn't come. Something felt unfinished, like a tremor beneath the surface of the night. Morning came with sunlight, but the tension in the air hadn't dissolved. People gathered in small groups outside, speaking nervously. Their voices were hushed, their glances sharp, as though the storm had left behind something far heavier than broken branches and flooded gutters. When the boy stepped outside, he saw it immediately, a black car parked at the end of the street. 3 men in suits, polished and confident, moved around it with a kind of practiced authority. They weren't neighbors. They weren't police. They weren't anyone who belonged here. And with a sinking feeling, he noticed something worse. They were carrying a photograph. His photograph. The boy froze behind a fence, watching from the only cover he could find as the men approached the nearest house. They knocked firmly, their movements precise and businesslike. When the door opened, one of them held up the photograph, displaying it to the neighbor inside. Even from where he crouched, the boy could see the stiff way the neighbor's face changed, the fear that flickered in their eyes. The men's voices were calm, almost polite, but their posture was rigid, their expressions controlled. They pointed toward different houses, directing their questions methodically, moving down the street with a cold sense of purpose. The boy felt fear coil tightly in his stomach, its grip unrelenting. They were looking for him, but he had done nothing except help an old man survive a storm. His heart pounded painfully in his chest as he ducked even lower behind the fence, pressing himself against the wooden slats. He watched as the men continued door to door, showing his picture to people who didn't dare refuse them. His breath shook as he tried to make sense of it all. Why would men like them care about him? What could they possibly want from a poor black boy who had simply tried to do the right thing? He thought of his mother inside the apartment, folding laundry or checking the fridge, planning meals and stretching every dollar she could. She didn't know what was happening outside. She didn't know that danger was circling their home like a predator. He wanted to run to her, warn her, hide behind her tired arms the way he had when he was younger. But he knew he couldn't. If he ran to her now, he'd be leading these men straight to her. And he couldn't risk that. He couldn't risk anyone being hurt. The suits moved with increasing scrutiny, their eyes narrowing, their steps slowing as if they could sense they were getting closer. The boy's pulse hammered harder. The storm had seemed terrifying the night before, but this silent hunt in the bright morning light felt far more dangerous, far more suffocating. Something had followed him home from that storm. Something that didn't care he was just a black boy trying to do the right thing. Something that wasn't leaving until it found him. He pressed his back against the rough wooden fence, splinters biting into his skin through his thin shirt, but he didn't dare move. Every sound felt louder, every breath felt risky. The neighborhood, usually noisy with kids and music and arguments, had fallen into a heavy, unnatural silence. Only the distant rumble of traffic and the low murmur of the men's voices cut through the stillness. He tried to make himself smaller, as if the fence could swallow him whole, as if invisibility was something he could force into existence simply by wanting it badly enough. From where he crouched, he could see parts of the street through thin cracks between the boards. One of the men in suits stood near a doorway, showing his photograph to a neighbor who looked like they wished they could melt into the floor. The neighbor's eyes widened slightly, then darted nervously toward the area where the boy usually walked or played. It was brief, just a flicker, but the man in the suit noticed. Of course he noticed. Men like him were trained to search for the smallest details. He leaned in closer to the neighbor, his lips moving, his expression calm but sharpened with intent. The neighbor swallowed hard and shook their head, pretending not to know anything. But fear had its own language, and these men were fluent. The boy's heart pounded so loudly he was convinced anyone, would hear it and turn their head. He didn't understand what these men wanted from him, why they were searching for him with such precision. They weren't police, not the kind who patrolled this neighborhood anyway. Their clothes were too clean, their posture too confident, their silence too controlled. They didn't look like people who came to solve problems. They looked like people who arrived when someone else had already decided the outcome. And whatever that outcome was, it wasn't going to favor him. He thought about his mother just a few houses away, perhaps humming gently as she folded clothes or staring into the almost empty fridge, calculating how long the remaining food would last. She had no idea that danger stood on their street, that her son hid behind a fence while strangers hunted him with cold determination. A part of him ached to run to her, to let her arms wrap around him in that familiar way that made him feel safe. But safety was a fragile illusion today. If he ran home, he wouldn't just be risking himself. He'd be bringing these men straight to her door, and he couldn't do that. He wouldn't. His muscles ached from staying still, from crouching so long, from holding fear in his chest like a breath he wasn't allowed to release. Then he shifted slightly, just enough to relieve the cramp forming in his leg. But the movement loosened a tiny stone beneath his shoe. It rolled, clicking softly against another. The sound was quiet, almost nothing, but in the stillness of the neighborhood it felt like a crash. The man closest to his hiding spot paused. The boy stopped breathing instantly, pressing his lips together so tightly they hurt. He watched through the thin crack in the fence as the man turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing just a fraction, as if he sensed the faint tremor of fear vibrating through the wood. He took one step toward the fence, then another, his polished shoes crushing damp gravel beneath them. The boy felt his heartbeat thudding against the inside of his chest, loud and frantic, certain the man would hear it. Each footstep seemed heavier than the last, each inch closing the distance between suspicion and discovery. The man's jaw tightened slightly, a faint shadow of annoyance flickering across his face, as though the storm or the silence or the neighborhood itself dared to keep secrets from him. He reached the edge of the fence and tilted his head, listening. The boy dug his fingers into the dirt, willing himself to dissolve into it, to become nothing more than another forgotten piece of the neighborhood. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, praying the man would turn away, that the tiny sound he made wouldn't unravel everything. Just then, another voice called out from the street, sharp enough to break the tension. "We checked over there." "Nothing," the man hesitated, his attention shifting. The boy slowly opened his eyes just in time to see the man glance back over his shoulder. For a brief second, the boy saw his profile framed by the gray morning light, sharp jawline, smooth hair, expression carved from stone. The man exhaled, almost in frustration, then turned away and walked back toward the others without another look. Relief washed over the boy so intensely it nearly made him dizzy. His lungs fought to pull in air, his body trembling from the effort of holding still for so long. He almost let out a small sob but swallowed it quickly, forcing himself to stay quiet. Fear and relief tangled in his chest like two vines pulling in opposite directions. But even as the immediate danger faded, he knew he couldn't stay pressed against this fence forever. The longer he remained here, the more likely it became that someone would spot him, that the man would circle back, that the sound of another pebble might betray him. He needed a plan. He needed to move before luck stopped protecting him. His mind raced through possibilities. The alley near the corner store, the back of the old church, the narrow path behind the playground. But every place came with the same problem. He was just a poor black boy in a neighborhood with very few places to hide. And the men searching for him carried themselves like people who had all the time in the world. He decided his best chance was to move when they shifted focus, when they were talking among themselves, when their sharp eyes weren't scanning every corner of the neighborhood. He waited, forcing himself to breathe slowly even though panic pressed hard against his ribs. One of the men pulled out a phone, speaking into it in a low, controlled tone that the boy couldn't quite make out. Another checked something inside the car, leaning down with the kind of casual confidence that came from believing everything was already under control. The third man walked toward the end of the street, his back turned for just a moment longer than before. It wasn't much, but sometimes survival depended on moments that small. The boy slid along the fence, staying as low as he could, his knees scraping against the dirt. He could feel twigs snapping beneath him, each tiny crack echoing far louder in his mind than it truly was. He didn't dare look back, not yet. When he reached the end of the fence, he found a narrow gap where the wood had rotted away from years of neglect. The opening was barely wide enough for him, but fear made him smaller, more determined. He squeezed through, his shirt catching on a jagged edge before he shoved himself free and tumbled into the next yard. The sudden shift of space felt like stepping into a different world, one slightly safer but still filled with danger. He darted behind an old shed covered in peeling paint, its door hanging crookedly from rusted hinges. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, but he forced himself forward again, cutting through a line of thick bushes that separated 1 yard from another. Branches scratched against his arms, tugging at his clothes as though trying to pull him back. He pushed through them anyway, emerging into the alley behind the houses. The alley was cluttered with trash cans, broken furniture, and the skeletal remains of an old bicycle. Damp cardboard sagged under his feet, and stray cats scattered at the sound of his arrival. He ducked behind a large trash bin, pressing his back to its cool, dented surface as he struggled to collect his thoughts. His chest burned and his legs trembled, but stopping wasn't an option. Not when each second could mean the difference between escape and being found. For a moment, all he could hear was the distant murmur of the men's voices and the pounding rhythm of his own heartbeat. He peeked out from behind the bin, scanning both ends of the alley. One direction led deeper into the neighborhood, a twisting route of fences and yards he could maybe lose them in. The other opened toward the main road where more people would be, where noise and crowds might hide him. But something tugged at him, not fear but memory. The old man's frail body leaning on him, the whispered gratitude, the sense that the old man might now be in danger too. That thought took hold in his chest, pulling him in a direction he hadn't expected to choose. He knew what would make sense. Most people would choose the main road, the safer route, the one that offered the illusion of protection in numbers, the way noise and crowds could swallow a frightened boy whole and hide him in the chaos. But something tugged at him from the other direction, an insistent pull that wrapped around him tighter than fear. He couldn't shake the image of the old man's trembling steps, the exhaustion etched into every line of his frail face, the way he had barely held himself upright in the storm. That memory pressed against the panic in his chest, cutting through the dread. If the men were searching for him because of that night, then the old man might be at risk too. And if anything happened to him because the boy had walked away without checking, he wouldn't be able to live with that. He swallowed hard, wiped rain and sweat from his forehead, and turned toward the old man's street. Each step in that direction felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself resisted him, warning him to stay away. But he kept going. The alleys grew quieter the closer he got, the kind of eerie stillness that made the world feel paused mid-breath. Houses that once felt familiar now loomed with shadows that stretched across their porches like watchful hands. No kids shouted. No music blared from open windows. No screen doors slammed. It felt like the entire neighborhood had drawn inward, folding itself into silence. When he turned onto the old man's street, an uneasy chill crept along his spine. The house stood exactly where he had left it, but something about it felt wrong. The front door was closed, but a window to the left was cracked open, curtains drifting softly like a quiet signal. At first glance, nothing looked disturbed, but beneath that stillness something felt off, too off. He approached slowly, each footstep deliberate. His heart thudded harder with every movement. He scanned the street, no cars he didn't recognize, no men in suits lingering outside. Just an ordinary house that no longer felt ordinary. He knocked softly at first, then a little harder. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. His breath quickened. He reached for the doorknob, expecting it to resist, but it turned easily beneath his fingers. The door creaked open with a low groan that sent shivers through him. The house was dim inside, lit only by thin shafts of daylight slipping through the gaps in the curtains. The air felt thick, heavy with something he couldn't name. The smell of old wood mixed with something metallic and bitter, something that made the back of his throat tighten. His shoes creaked on the floorboards as he stepped inside, calling out quietly. No one responded. The silence felt wrong, deeply wrong, and as he moved farther into the house, dread pressed closer around him. A mug lay shattered near the kitchen doorway, pieces scattered like evidence of a struggle. The boy's breath caught as he stepped over the fragments, each shard glinting faintly in the little light that filtered through the curtains. The chair where the old man had sat the night before was slightly askew, turned just enough to suggest someone had grabbed it, moved it, forced something to happen here. A pulse of fear raced through him as he moved deeper into the house, every creak of the floorboards echoing like a warning. The air felt colder the farther he walked, pressing against him with a heaviness that made each step harder to take. When he reached the living room, he froze. The old man was there, slumped in his chair, breathing shallowly, eyes closed. For a terrifying moment, the boy thought he wasn't breathing at all. His heart lurched into his throat as he rushed to his side, reaching out with shaking hands. His fingers hovered in the air for a split second, afraid to touch, afraid of what he might discover. Then the old man stirred, blinking slowly, his eyes cloudy with confusion and fear. Relief washed through the boy so sharply it almost hurt, but that relief vanished quickly when he saw the bruises, dark marks wrapped around the old man's wrists, clear signs of someone grabbing him, restraining him. Someone had been here, someone had hurt him, and the boy knew exactly who. The old man's lips trembled as he tried to speak, his voice thin and broken, as though words themselves had become too heavy to carry. The boy leaned closer, straining to catch each fragmented whisper. The old man told him that men had come. They had questioned him, demanded answers about the storm, about who helped him, about whether he had spoken to anyone. They treated him not as someone who needed kindness, but as an obstacle, something in their way, something that needed to be pressured, forced, bent. When he couldn't give them what they wanted, they punished him. Not loudly, not in ways that would draw attention, but in quiet, calculated ways that left hidden damage, ways that left bruises where clothing could cover them, ways that left a man shaking from more than just age. The boy felt anger mixing with fear, a burning knot rising in his chest. It wasn't fair. None of this was fair. He had only tried to help someone who needed him, and somehow that small act had turned into a threat, something powerful men cared about. The old man squeezed his wrist suddenly, surprising him with the strength still hidden in his frail fingers. His cloudy eyes sharpened with urgency as he whispered the truth that made the boy's skin prickle. They believed he knew something. They believed the old man had told him more than he had, and they weren't going to stop until they found him. The boy swallowed hard, dread crawling slowly up his spine. The boy opened his mouth to protest, to say he knew absolutely nothing, to insist that he was just a kid who had walked someone home in a storm. But deep down, he knew it didn't matter. Innocence didn't erase suspicion. Not for someone like him, not for a poor black boy whose existence people questioned before they ever bothered to learn his name. The old man's trembling fingers tightened around his wrist again, pulling his attention away from fear and toward urgency. His tired eyes, clouded but still filled with something painfully human, begged the boy to listen. He told him in breaths that rattled weakly from his chest that he needed to leave. Now, before they returned, before they found him here. His voice cracked under the weight of desperation, and the boy felt it settle into his bones. He nodded slowly, his throat burning with the effort of swallowing back fear. Standing on shaky legs, he glanced toward the front door, the same door he had helped guide the old man through the night before. Now it felt like a door into danger, a line he wasn't sure he could cross safely. He took a step toward it, then froze. A shadow slid across the front window, smooth, controlled, unmistakably human. His breath caught in his throat as voices filtered through the thin walls. Calm, cold, confident. The kind of voices that belonged to people who believed they had already won. His heart dropped like a stone. Panic surged through him, quick and sharp, stealing the air from his lungs. He darted away from the door and flattened himself against the wall, pressing into the plaster as though he could sink into it and disappear. His mind raced, flipping through possible escape routes. The back door, maybe a window, if he could squeeze through it quickly enough, but every option felt too slow, too risky. The old man's breathing grew faster, shallow, and panicked. The knock at the door was slow and deliberate, each strike echoing through the house like a countdown. These were not people who waited for permission. They didn't linger long before letting themselves in. The door creaked open, the hinges complaining softly as polished shoes stepped over the threshold. The boy could see them from where he stood, just a few feet away, separated only by a thin strip of wall. He pressed his palm against his chest, trying to quiet his pounding heart, trying not to gasp as the men moved deeper into the home. Their footsteps were steady, unhurried, confident. They spoke to the old man with a chilling smoothness, their tones devoid of compassion, as though this were nothing more than a routine task. And the boy knew this moment would decide everything. One of them asked again where the boy was. The old man, voice trembling, insisted he hadn't seen him. The boy's throat tightened as he pressed himself harder against the wall, wishing he could vanish. He didn't want the old man to suffer more because of him, but stepping out now would be like walking straight into a trap. The men moved slowly through the room, their polished shoes clicking softly against the floorboards. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. Their confidence filled the space like another presence entirely. The old man tried to sit taller, but fear shook through him, betraying every lie he attempted to hold steady. The men exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them, and one of them took a deliberate step toward the hallway. The same hallway the boy had nearly tried to escape through moments earlier. The slightest shift of the boy's shoe against the floor made a soft sound, barely more than a whisper, but in the tense silence it was enough. The conversation stopped instantly. A thick heaviness settled over the room. Footsteps changed direction, turning heavier, approaching the place where the boy stood hidden. His breath caught as the danger closed in around him. One of the men moved closer, his footsteps turning heavier as he approached the area where the boy stood hidden. The boy could hear the faint rustle of the man's suit, the quiet exhale as he paused, listening. Every second stretched painfully, each breath feeling too loud in his chest. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing desperately that the wall behind him could swallow him whole. But the world didn't bend for wishes like his. The man stepped forward and looked around the corner. Their eyes met. For a brief second, everything froze. The boy saw not curiosity or concern in the man's face, but cold calculation, something ruthless, something that saw him not as a child, but as a threat. The man didn't shout or hesitate. He simply reached out and grabbed the boy's arm, his grip like iron, yanking him from his hiding spot with terrifying certainty. The boy gasped, instinct taking over as he tried to pull away, but the man's hold only tightened. The other men turned toward the sound, their expressions unmoved, as if they had expected this all along. The old man struggled weakly in his chair, but one dismissive gesture from the suited men froze him in place. The danger had found the boy at last. The boy gasped, instinct taking over as he tried to pull away, but the man tightened his hold, yanking him forward into the center of the room. His feet stumbled across the floorboards, his breath coming out in sharp, frightened bursts. The other two men turned toward him, their cold, assessing eyes settling on him with a disturbing lack of surprise, as though his capture had been inevitable from the moment they stepped into the house. The old man struggled to rise from his chair, his hands shaking violently, but one of the suited men raised a hand in a small, dismissive gesture that stopped him instantly. That simple motion carried more threat than a shout ever could. The boy trembled under the crushing weight of their attention, feeling smaller than he ever had in his life. One of the men lifted the photograph they had shown the neighbors, comparing it to the boy's face before giving a small nod. "That's him," he said softly, as if confirming an item on a checklist. Power moved through the room like a cold wind, and the boy felt it pressing into him, swallowing any hope he had left. He wanted to explain, to insist he hadn't done anything wrong, but the words tangled in his throat, trapped beneath fear. In that moment, the boy realized this wasn't just about the storm, or about helping a stranger, or about some misunderstanding that could be fixed with the truth. This was about him, about who he was, what he looked like, and what they had already decided he might be. That understanding hollowed him out as the men pulled him toward the door, dragging him from the house and down the steps. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet street, stretching toward him like warnings he couldn't outrun. The neighborhood felt unfamiliar now, every window watching yet staying closed, every door hiding people too afraid to intervene. Fear was stronger than justice here, and the boy felt its weight in every hesitant curtain and silent porch. The men said nothing as they guided him toward the black car waiting at the curb. Their silence was more frightening than shouting. It meant they were certain, confident in control. When they opened the back door, panic surged through him. "Please, I didn't do anything," he whispered, but the words fell uselessly into the air. With a firm shove, they forced him inside. The door slammed shut, sealing him in darkness thick with dread. The engine started, humming low as the men climbed in, one behind the wheel, one in the passenger seat, and one settling beside the boy in the back. The presence of the man next to him felt overwhelming, his shoulder brushing the boy's every time the car shifted. The boy pressed himself against the opposite door, trying to make himself smaller, but the space felt suffocating. The tinted windows turned the world outside into a blur of colors he could barely recognize. With each street they passed, he felt pieces of his life slipping away. The store where he swept floors, the playground where he fixed a broken swing, the corners where he had laughed with friends. When the car finally turned off the main road and into an industrial area, dread tightened in his chest. Warehouses loomed like forgotten giants, their rusted doors and cracked windows swallowing the last traces of sunlight. The car slowed beside one of them, its faded paint peeling like old scars. The man beside him grabbed his arm again, dragging him out of the vehicle and into the dim, echoing space inside. Dust floated in narrow beams of light. A metal chair waited in the center. "Sit," one of them ordered. His legs trembled as he obeyed, fear settling over him like a second skin. One of the men stepped forward. "We know you helped him," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something cold. "We know he spoke to you." "He didn't," the boy insisted, his voice trembling. "He didn't say anything." But his words meant nothing here. The man walked closer, leaning down until their eyes were level. His stare was sharp, unblinking, searching for cracks in the boy's fear. "Do you know who he worked for?" he asked. The boy shook his head. The man straightened, pacing with slow, deliberate steps like someone lecturing a child who needed to understand the gravity of a lesson. "He was a bookkeeper," he said, "for someone powerful. Someone who trusted him until he made dangerous choices." The boy's breath hitched. "I don't know anything about that," he whispered, "but you were with him the night he disappeared." "He didn't disappear," the boy protested, voice thin. "He was at home, I saw him." The men exchanged a glance, something heavy and silent passing between them. Fear tightened in the boy's chest. Then one of them crouched, gripping his chin, forcing him to look up. "You're going to tell us everything." The boy's eyes filled with terror, his breath trembling as he stared into the face of a man who didn't see a child, only a threat. A sound cut through the tension, a distant, sharp clang, like something being knocked over just outside the warehouse. All three men reacted instantly. One moved to the door, another scanned the shadows, and the third tightened his grip on the boy's shoulder. The boy's pulse raced as hope flickered weakly inside him. The man at the door cracked it open, letting in a sliver of daylight, and for a moment that thin beam felt like a lifeline. But the door shut again and darkness folded back around them. Then another sound came, voices. Not the calm, cold voices of the suited men, but louder ones, layered and rising, familiar, urgent, the old shopkeeper, a neighbor from down the street, people he had seen his whole life. Their voices grew stronger, angrier, echoing against the warehouse walls. The men stiffened. They hadn't expected anyone to come. More footsteps gathered outside, more shadows shifting. Someone shouted, "We know he's in there." Fear and disbelief tangled inside the boy. They had come for him. People who rarely raised their voices, who rarely challenged anyone, were standing outside together. The men exchanged harsh whispers, glancing between the door and the rear exit. For the first time, he saw fear in their eyes. His community, quiet, worn down, overlooked, was no longer silent. They were here, and they weren't leaving. The man tightened his grip, dragging the boy toward the rear exit as the voices outside grew louder, more determined. "Go out the back," he snapped to the others. "We'll lose them." But when he pushed the door open, he froze. The alley behind the warehouse was filled with people. Neighbors who normally walked with lowered eyes now stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the way. Elderly women clutched each other for courage. Teenagers stared with clenched fists. Men who had endured years of quiet injustice stood tall, their faces set with unwavering resolve. One familiar voice rose above the others, the church choir elder who had always said, "We look out for our own." "You let that boy go," he commanded. For the first time, the men hesitated. One loosened his grip. Another stepped back. They exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement that their power meant nothing in the face of so many witnesses. They retreated deeper into the warehouse just as officers arrived, answering the community's call. The men in suits were detained, their authority stripped under the weight of collective defiance. When the boy stepped outside, exhausted and trembling, his mother burst through the crowd. Tears streamed down her face as she pulled him into her arms, holding him with a fierce, trembling relief. He clung to her, finally able to breathe. Neighbors surrounded them, offering protection, comfort, and soft reassurances that he was safe now. But the boy knew that safety was a fragile word, one that didn't erase what had happened inside that warehouse, or the fear that had clung to him like a second skin. Later, after officers took statements and the crowd slowly dispersed, after his mother finally released him from her trembling embrace, he found himself sitting on the steps outside their building. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the pavement. The street felt quiet again, but not in the same way it had before. He watched younger kids riding their bikes, unaware of how close danger had come. He watched neighbors talk in low voices, glancing at him with mixtures of sympathy, admiration, and sorrow. Life was returning to normal around him, but he wasn't the same. Something in him had shifted, sharpened. He stared down the street, remembering the storm, the old man's trembling hand, the cold grip of the suited men, and the strength of the community that had stood up for him. He didn't feel invisible anymore. He felt changed, older in a way no child should be, aware now of how quickly the world could turn on someone who looked like him. He felt older, sharper, more aware. He understood now that the world could twist an act of kindness into something dangerous, that a simple gesture could place a target on the back of a black boy who had done nothing but care. Yet he also understood something else, something powerful. He was not alone. His community, weary and overlooked, had risen for him when it mattered most. Their unity had shattered the silence that had held them in place for years. The old man, fragile but alive, had spoken the truth when fear could have swallowed him. As the boy inhaled the cooling evening air, he realized this story wasn't just his. It belonged to every child who had been misjudged, every neighbor who had stayed quiet too long, every voice that trembled before it found its strength. He looked down the street where everything had changed and wondered how many more storms children would have to survive simply because the world refused to see them as children at all. The sky dimmed slowly, casting a warm glow over the cracked pavement. And with that lingering question hanging softly in the fading light, one truth settled deep in his heart. The storm had ended, but the fight for dignity, safety, and justice was only just beginning.